Hey everybody, welcome to the Feminist Podcast. Today we'll be discussing the radicalization pipeline, revealing the truth behind how men and boys get indoctrinated. Have you ever wondered how nice little Johnny with a bright future, typically after some type of mass violence or serial killing or terroristic act, we'll see mothers and fathers and other relatives of radicalized individuals say that they never expected their child or their loved one to do something of this magnitude. During my time creating the radicalization pipeline as a human rights leader, leading the military sexual trauma movement, as I was assessing risk factors, I had read different manifestos from men who had committed acts of mass violence and terrorism. And the sources that they would typically cite would be Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. And some of these manifestos would discuss an affinity for creating laws that oppress women. So as I began on my journey of researching how exactly these men and boys can go from being young men and boys with a future to absolutely creating existential amounts of harm within the United States, I felt that I really needed to understand what was happening. And I came to research this in a really unexpected way. During my time leading the military sexual trauma movement, I had built teams to counter intel certain white supremacist groups within the Marine Corps and veteran community. This was necessary for my safety and well-being because there was an abundance of smear campaigns along with threats to my life, my well-being, being doxxed, harassment, and including an assassination attempt on my life. And over a 2.5-year period of counter-intelling, I had generated well over 20,000 files of information and behaviors into how the radicalization pipelines operate. And I was able to create the radicalization pipeline as a risk management tool to be able to identify certain people who were threats to my life and well-being and to my work in human rights. As I developed and matured the radicalization pipeline, I was able to accurately predict various threats to my life, as well as various terroristic threats to the United States, including the January 6th insurrection. On November 11th, 2020, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Commandant's house in front of the Marine Corps barracks at 8th and I, where I was hosting the Fight for Our Freedom press conference in order to help 2 female Marines who were wrongfully incarcerated to get out of jail. By this point, I had already developed the radicalization pipeline for 2 years, and I was already using it as a predictive measure because I understood how the communities operated within the manosphere and their likelihood to be violent or not. I was also able to predict, based on conversations that they would have, what they would potentially do or what actions that they would take in the real world and how they would organize within social media. Through this experience, I was able to gain insight into the economy that sustains the radicalization pipeline, as well as how the indoctrination of men and boys happens within the radicalization pipeline. And this process became a healing process for me because at the age of 16, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. And while I was at MOS school at the age of 17, I experienced child sex trafficking while on active duty. In the process of trying to pursue justice for the human rights violations that I was experiencing, I instead was met with tremendous amounts of violence and torture. These are against the very foundations of universal human rights. And I came to understand how these men and these boys in the military get to the point of dehumanizing women and girls to the point of seeing us as objects. I also came to learn about the intersection of my gender and my ethnicity as a Caribbean American. I came to learn that I was dealing with intersectional discrimination. And intersectional feminist philosophy gave me the answers that I was looking for. Essentially, intersectional feminism identifies that there are layers to oppression due to a hierarchy that is created. In my circumstance, as a minor serving in the United States military of Latin American identity and a girl, all of those factors and the lack of power that I had as a junior Marine were all of the reasons that added to the power plays and power dynamics that led to the perpetual sexual violence that I dealt with the entire time I served in the United States Marine Corps. And these levels of oppression consisted of misogyny, sexism, and racism. And due to the physical and legal and administrative violence that I endured, it has been a very difficult process to pursue proper restorative justice. Everywhere that I turned into the legal system, no one could help me due to the lack of laws that were written. As a result, I began to author legislation, and I authored the No Bad Paper bills, which were signed into law as the Restoration of Honor Act of 2019. This package of laws became the first and only intersectional military and veterans legislation in United States history. The passage of this legislation caused severe upset amongst the military manosphere communities. For those of you who do not know what the manosphere communities are, they are stages 1 through 4 of the radicalization pipeline. Stage 1 begins with male insecurity. Men and boys will begin to Google, why don't girls like me, or why can't I attract women? And instead of returning results that are educational in nature, Google, YouTube, and social media sites return self-help from the manosphere communities, which are disguised as self-help programs, but are really propaganda. There are economic motivations within billionaire patriarchy to develop men and boys into extremism. And much of the radicalization pipeline are funded by the alt-right and billionaire patriarchy in order to preserve and consolidate power amongst a white male billionaire class. The ruling class, or the American oligarchy, is largely anti-democracy and pro-fascism. In order for the radicalization pipeline to be successful and to monetize it, we have to understand that it is political in nature. The methods that are used are through psychological indoctrination, and this indoctrination in turn causes social structures to emerge. This is where the struggle and the fight for human rights begins. So the question is, how do we get from male insecurity to domestic terrorism? Each group and community within the radicalization pipeline indoctrinates men and boys within these communities by beginning to show them content that dehumanizes women and girls. The concept of masculinity is performative in nature. By American standards, men and boys need to attract a lot of women, make a lot of money, and have great bodies to be seen as respectable masculine men in society. This gender construct is affirmed through billionaire patriarchy because of those who don't meet the criteria then end up into the radicalization pipeline because they will feel insecure and inadequate because they don't meet the standards that are created by billionaire patriarchy. And they don't realize that this is a social construct. So they internalize this inadequacy and this insecurity as if something is wrong with themselves. It is this patriarchal propaganda that is damaging to our men and our boys, and in turn, damages and harms our entire society. I'm going to discuss Andrew Tate as the example of how an effective radicalization pipeline operates. Andrew Tate lures in men and boys through his Hustlers University or his business front. This is known as like a male self-help community where You'll learn how to make money through crypto trading. You'll learn how to attract women through supplements and working out. You'll build community and you'll learn to be cool. So the advertising sounds like it addresses all of these men and boys' problems. So for $49.99, why not? It's cheaper than therapy, and therapy, I don't have to share my feelings. Why not? So for the low price of $49.99, they begin to get indoctrinated into these involuntary celibate pickup communities that are within Hustler University. And just like within the military and veteran communities, what happens in those communities is that men and boys will be shown dehumanizing memes of women and girls, particularly with women political leaders or women in politics or in human rights. The idea is to portray every woman in power as a feminist. And a lot of these memes will be portraying women and girls in a way in which we are seen as less than, and with propaganda saying that we should be submissive, and if we were traditional, we would be allowing men to own us and we would be in our place, right? So during my time leading the movement, there was a group of Marines who made a meme of me, and I was swimming in a rock quarry that had turned into a large pond. And of course, they turned it into a meme that said, "She's a sea wok," which means a woman outside of the kitchen. They were just adding the word sea in there because I was in the water and it was referring to the Navy and Marine Corps. And when I endured the abuse and violence in the military as a minor, I would get called a lot of names like that. Wook, walking mattress, slut, hoe, anything that was derogatory. And these same patterns were occurring within these communities. And at this point, as a movement leader and understanding what I endured in the military and what the risks are for me going public with my story, I understood that it was time for me to investigate. So I built an online underground railroad and I began to investigate all of these communities and how they operate. So what happens with these memes is that once incels are learning manipulation and are being fed anti-feminist and anti-woman propaganda, then they end up getting recruited into men rights activist communities. And you will hear a lot of Andrew Tate talking about men's rights. Now, realistically, the audience of incels that's being radicalized, they have rights already, right? In the United States, they're represented 2-to-1, and legislation has always been favorable to white men. So in United States history, they have not dealt with discrimination or subjugation of any kind in the last 250 years, which has given many of them a leg up and has created the white male billionaire class. In politics, they have a 2-to-1 representation, meaning 66% of all people in politics on the congressional level are white men, while white men only make up 33% of the entire United States population. This power structure creates a system where accountability for horrible behavior goes unaccounted for. We see how on the religious right, a number of pastors and a number of Christian Republican senators are involved in sex trafficking and child sex abuse, but yet the right turns a blind eye to it consistently. And we are seeing the same behavior play out with Andrew Tate, where the alt-right and the mainstream right are staying silent regarding him being arrested for sex trafficking. And if we remain allowing this pattern to happen, we're going to keep creating more and more victims through modern slavery. So as the radicalization pipeline moves forward, these men and boys are being indoctrinated into misogyny and sexism. By this point, there's a full-blown hatred of women. And what happens is that at this stage, there's an entitlement to women's bodies. And as a result, there's an economy through sexual violence, revenge porn, and online sex trafficking and in-person sex trafficking that occurs to support this economy for misogynists and sexists who create a demand for sex through entitlement. And this will be behind Hustlers University There will be other communities that will be private invitation only, and this is where you'll see Andrew Tate sex trafficking women in that business and now collecting money and making his money from that ecosystem. So as the pipeline goes on, there's Christian nationalism, white supremacist patriarchy, and domestic terrorism. And that becomes the extremist wing, where hate is not only for women and girls, it then becomes other minority groups and other religious minorities as well. In stages 5 through 7, violence is the primary mode to instill that extremist group's will. An example would be pro-lifers who are from a Christian church going outside of an abortion clinic and then all of a sudden blowing it up. So this pattern continues throughout the rest of the extremist pipeline, right? They'll say that they're pro-life, but in reality, they're willing to kill people to pursue their whacked ideology. 2 new theories for this, which are psychosocial misogyny and sexism and psychosocial racism. So psychosocial is an adjective that refers to the psychological and social factors that intersect through mass communication, which can influence an individual's thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. It is a term that is used to describe the complex interactions between the psychological and social aspects of a person's life, including their relationships and involvement in groups. Psychosocial factors can have a significant impact on a person's mental health and well-being, and they can also play a role in the development of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and violence. So understanding that helps to understand misogyny, sexism, and racism, and understand the role that psychosocial misogyny and sexism have, as well as psychosocial racism on our society and the violence. So how do psychosocial racism and psychosocial misogyny and sexism come into play? So the alt-right propaganda uses some terms that I've coined: biology, milliganda, and vetaganda as their main tools of recruitment and indoctrination into the... Throughout my book, The Pathway Towards Peace, I discuss these terms. So let's define them. Biology or biology. Patriarchy uses religious dogma in order to maintain power. These falsehoods are supported by interpretation of religious doctrine. In modern era, this dogma is spoken about across social media and the manosphere, and what I call papa-biology. It's religious dogma that's made to sound scientific. The term is something that I coined in my Medium publication titled The Feminist, in an article called Debunking the 13 Most Popular Falsehoods of the Patriarchy. Let's talk about milliganda and vetaganda. It's the U.S. military's use of propaganda in the press to showcase hyper-masculine men and toxic masculinity ideals. This also transfers over into the veteran communities and networks who use the same tactics to create vetaganda. This creates an ideology of performative masculinity where gender constructs that are made by patriarchy need to be enforced within military and veteran structures. And as a result, cultures of abuse thrive. And this is why the rates of military sexual trauma keep increasing and why we're seeing higher amounts of radicalization and extremism within the military and veteran communities. Most notably, we saw this with the January 6th insurrection. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had predicted that the January 6th insurrection would happen. So I gave a speech titled Female Marines, America's Babies Need You, which is available on Spotify. About 20 minutes into that speech, I discussed the connections of military sexual trauma to white supremacy in the ranks. In other words, I discuss psychosocial misogyny and sexism as a precursor to a national security issue that's on the horizon that will be far greater, and there will be a high number of military and veterans involved. I say something of that nature in the speech about 20 minutes in. And it was because by that point, I was already 2 years into developing the pipeline and had been effectively using it to predict risks that would occur. And 6 weeks later, the worst sight I've seen and the worst attack I've seen on democracy happened. Billionaire patriarchy reflects the group of white men who control our social media channels. radicalization is highly profitable for them because it also helps them to maintain control. And because the First Amendment doesn't adequately transfer over, they have control over what they allow and don't allow on their platforms. And while many of them say that they don't allow content that incites violence or organizing, they most certainly do. Many times you'll see a bias towards human rights and even feminist, where our content is taken down or policed at a higher rate for affirming human rights or discussing human rights abuses, whereas organizing continues to be on the rise for the manosphere community as well as for extremist groups. This is highly alarming because we're creating and perpetuating violence. In my upcoming book, The Pathway Towards Peace, the United States Human Rights Manifesto, I discuss this entire process more at length, how these systems operate and how it's preventing us from pursuing peace in our society. We have a choice to make. We can either continue on the path towards destruction and extinction, or we can turn this ship around and we can navigate towards better waters. To learn more about how you can contribute to affirming human rights in the United States and help our society and our democracy move towards peace, send me a message on TikTok with your email and I will add you to our email list for when The Pathway Towards Peace is released. Together, we can protect and defend our democracy and American human rights.